Welcome everybody to the RGW session of CDS Squid. There's a link to an Etherpad in chat. I think the goal here is just to discuss planning for the S release, socialize some of the initiatives that we're looking at. Ultimately, this stuff will be used to update the Ceph backlog on Trello.
We lost him for a second there, right?
Apologies, I'm having connection issues. Don't know how much of that you guys heard.
I think you left off at you're going to add whatever we discussed to the backlog for S or something along those lines.
Okay, great. So yeah, we have about an hour. Want to make sure that we cover everything here. So I don't know that we have a ton of time for discussion, but each thing I would like to just kind of give a short outline of what the plans are and what we're trying to do. The D4N data cache is a project that we've had going for a long time now. Recently started merging things. Would somebody like to give a summary of what we might expect to have for the S release?
Well, I can try that. Others might be able to. I think the intent would be that they would have the upstream a kind of MVP, which I think I've tried to define as having sort of the key capabilities of the massive cloud research D4N. So we would have the ability that would include the ability to construct an RGW. Have both the integrated read caching and in basic form of the write back cache tier capabilities present. They'd be managed by the D4N filter. The integrated read cache is built on top of the D3N chunk cache that's distributed across RGW instances. That we'd be building on that for that part. Then I think the plan is to have a simplified S3 backend that does the write back cache. There's some additional flexibility available to do more things. Much of this relies on a Redis distributed database that accesses the cache directory, and that would be present as well. But I think that's the minimum. And if we got more there are more pieces we can use.
Thanks a lot, Matt. As I said, there's been a lot of ongoing work, and there's a meeting every Tuesday, I think, on the community calendar where we discuss this. Samara, is there anything you'd like to add?
I'm not sure what exactly constitutes as part of the S release, but for the next PR that I'm working on, I'm planning to have a fully working Redis driver a class, and then also the D4N policy should be working with the LFUDA cache replacement code, and then additionally the D4N read and other workflows that Preeta has outlined in the D4N features document that should be in place as well. And then finally, the CVP Redis library should be switched out with Boost Redis. And that's what I believe I have for the next PR that I will be releasing on, at least on my side, for the D4N features.
Great, thanks. All right, next up is about Aeroflight. We've been exploring some integrations there. I'm not sure exactly what what the initial feature would look like. Do we have any updated ideas on that? Maybe Eric or Matt?
The next effort on there is to find a front end which uses Aeroflight and just work on an integration so that front end could actually query RGW through the flight interface and do its retrievals and so forth. So just to get an end-to-end a proof concept of end-to-end use of Aeroflight. So that's kind of where the project stands at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And our aspiration would be that something like a Spark Connector V2 attachment would be possible, but we don't actually know whether that's viable.
Matt, I think some folks on the call can't hear you as clearly. But adding to what Eric said, I've got a very simple test program that can. Oh no, Casey left again. Ah, shoot. Well, nevertheless, since the call is being recorded, I've got something that would at least test the flight interface at a basic level that we could put in our Intuthology, but that's not a Spark connector or running an actual load on it. And I don't think we can run flight Intuthology because of CentOS, or because we're not running CentOS 9 yet, right?
The ability to go to CentOS 9, I believe, would allow us to upgrade to a more recent version of Aeroflight due to packaging issues and things of that sort. But the lack of CentOS 9 does not mean we can't make forward progress.
Oh, okay. In that case, maybe I'll put something together just so that we can get some kind of tests or see if whatever I have is useful enough to do some kind of basic testing for Aeroflight in Tuthology. And then I guess down the line we want to sub that out with something that actually runs some kind of load with it, like a Spark connector or some other data processing program.
Are you saying that we would do that in Tuthology? I'm not sure we would do that in Tuthology, but we do want to be able to be able to do testing and find measure throughput and things of that sort with a real world like load.
Oh no, I was just talking about since it's a different interface of RGW, just testing to make sure that the interface works and isn't broken.
Okay, I misunderstood you then, because I thought you were talking about putting it under load or something like that.
No, nothing like that. No.
Sorry.
Yeah, I kind of feel like we should figure out exactly what the integrations are going to look like and like plan it as a feature and build tests around that instead of building tests around the existing front end integration, which is not what we want it to look like in the long run, I think.
Well, I think there's going to be stepwise refinement involved in that. But so I don't know if we're committing to get into that level by S, but we'll try. If we we're like from our point of view, we would be focusing on analytics workload and Spark based. I think that would be most natural. I don't know if it's really realistic to believe that that'll be in Tuthology or not, but if we can get there, that's fine. It's fine with me.
All right, moving on to a couple zipper topics. Um, there's a lot of work going on for a POSIX-based file backend for RGW, and related interest in standalone RGW deployments, either based on POSIX file or on the DB store that we already have. Is Dan here to talk about the POSIX store?
Yep.
Hey, Dan.
So we will. What time frame are we talking about here?
This would be for the S release cycle, so probably 6 months or so of development.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll certainly have an MVP of a POSIX driver for S. How far along it is in terms of sort of non-minimal support will depend on basically how complicated adding those bits are. So, you know, things like versioning and stuff like that are high on our list, but may not make it for S depending on how hard it actually is to implement. I'm hoping we can get even versioning in, but we won't have anything like life cycle or things like that. In terms of standalone, we're making good progress. As soon as Caleb and Ali can figure out the testing issues with the module stuff, we'll get that in. That will be a huge step in the direction of true standalone. You can do sort of standalone now if you're willing to use DB Store, or if you're willing to use the branch that has the POSIX driver on it. But that's basically only useful at this point for development and testing and not for actual use. But I suspect we will have an MVP of standalone also in S.
All right. Yeah, I think in terms of deployment, there's interest in building something around Ceph ADM so that it could deploy RGWs with some local storage.
Right, and there's also interest in adding Rook support for standalone storage as well.
Cool. All right. Any other thoughts on Zipper before we move on? All right. There's also work going on around tracing. This is using Jaeger and integrating with the open tracing library. First step has already merged in just general support for traces. The RGW emits a few, but there's kind of some projects to get better coverage in RGW, threading traces through multi-site replication. And I think just building up ideas just for other use cases in general. Somebody added implementation that supports tracing on production clusters. Not quite sure what that means.
That was us with 11.11. I mean, in the documentation, at least so far, and from people that we've talked to, it looks like the current tracing implementation is mostly intended to be used by developers for debugging type purposes and isn't explicitly recommended for production at the moment. So we would like to start kind of testing it in production, at least some subset of it maybe, to be able to use it to debug issues that we see there. So whether or not it's practical to use everything that's implemented without impacting performance, I think that is an open question, at least for us. But we would like to be able to get some tracing data even in production clusters.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that is the ultimate goal, is to make it usable in production. I'm not too familiar with the Jaeger ecosystem in terms of how it's used and scaled, but my assumption is that the intent is to cover use cases that matter to you. And so I think your input on exactly what things we should be tracing would be really valuable.
Yeah, and also how to activate it. You know, we have the idea that we wanted to support conditional tracing, and so there's Lua hooks there as our default way to do that. By figuring out workflows that involve enabling traces for specific types of activity and connected graphs and stuff would you know, and how that affects hopefully helps mitigate performance costs would be really helpful too.
All right, next up is a section about labeled Prometheus metrics. This has been an initiative to expose Prometheus's labels all the way through Ceph's perf counter library. And one of the goals is to support filtering RGW's counters per user or per bucket, for example. I think this has some tricky scaling properties, but there's some design work that we're hoping can address that. And Ali has been working to build a prototype that we can do some scale testing on. Ali, anything you want to share about that?
No, I think you covered it pretty well. I had a chat with Yuval, who also wants to be able to add labels to some of the counters that he and Ali Masarwa had been working on. And also, I do have at least an initial subset of op-related and user and bucket-related counters that we'd like to see, and can give a presentation at the refactoring meeting of what exactly those counters are, if anyone's curious.
Thanks, Ali. Next is a multi-site section. One of the things that's been on the backlog is moving bucket index logs out of OMAP. There's OMAP deletes in particular are challenging for bucket index log trimming to keep up with. And so moving those to object data, it makes the deletes a lot easier. It does complicate the bucket index transaction, but there's a design and quite a bit of work done on this already. I know that there's other stuff that we're planning for multi-site. For example, trying to productize the archive zone sync module. Shilpa, is there any other multi-site stuff that you want to talk about?
I don't think there's anything else that's planned for us. I think you've pretty much covered everything.
All right. We've got several Bloomberg people on the call that are also interested in working on multi-site. Is there anything that you guys want to raise here?
Nothing as such as nothing as of now for us, to be honest.
All right. On the upstream issue tracker, we have a multi-site backlog of issues that we've been working through. So I imagine that we'll just make progress on some of that.
Yeah, we plan to pick up 2 of those, and we'll update them as we take them. Yeah.
Great. There's also been a lot of interest in Lua, and Yuval has been doing a lot of work there. Stuff around hardening so that there's less of a risk of Lua scripts interfering with performance. And then just enabling more features like storage in a background context so that scripts can have some persistent state that they operate on. And Matt also mentioned hooks from Lua into the tracing framework to conditionally enable traces per request.
I mean, I think hopefully we're creeping towards a future where it isn't just a packager that can turn on Lua, but it's something that appropriately credentialed users could add to workload safely.
All right, next up is async refactoring, which has been a long-standing initiative, kind of started with the Beast front end. There's kind of ongoing work to fully convert to the async model that Beast enables. Recently, after the Reef release, we merged a lot of more coverage for optional yield stuff. So we're hoping to take that to completion fairly soon and get test coverage to make sure that we don't regress there. And the goal is to drastically reduce the size of RGW's thread pool, which is 512 now. Other aspect of this is converting from the librados library to NeoRados. Adam's doing a lot of work there. And then there are plans to prototype multi-site based on C++ 20 coroutines. There's some branches that are starting on that. So interested to see progress there. Adam, anything you'd like to say about async refactoring in general?
No, I think you have it covered. Should be parallelizable. Once the 2 PRs I have now go in, anyone should be able to pick up and start doing the NeoRados stuff.
Great. Next one is QoS integration with librados. This has also been kind of a long-term goal of ours since the introduction of mclock in the OSD. RGW would love to take advantage of that to get some fairness between client requests and background work so that we can safely do things like garbage collection and log trimming without disrupting client workloads too much. Also ensuring that we have enough capacity to keep up with the background work. You know that this came up in the Rados CDS yesterday. And so we're looking forward to collaborate on that. I added this one about non-blocking reshard. I had written a design in 2019, but haven't had anybody to work on it. I'm still interested in it, but I think this might end up just staying kind of lower priority unless somebody wants to take it. Next one, admin ops API. I'm assuming this was you, Ali. Do you want to take this?
Yeah, I was the one that added that. There were just a couple of things. The first one is I know that Dan had talked about zipper refactor or making sure that the admin ops API is gonna guess independent of the stores or whatever the backend store is. I don't know how much Caleb addresses or how much Caleb's loadable modules PR addresses of that already, but uh, that might be something we might want to possibly add for this release. And the other one, and I discussed with Matt and Dan about this, is that uh, Rook especially uses the admin ops API almost exclusively. But I know for when it's connecting to external mode clusters, it does some funny things with the RGW admin command. And from what I can tell, the admin ops API is does a subset of what the RGW admin command can do. And I wonder if that subset should be made larger so that Rook or other users of the admin ops API don't have to resort to using the RGW admin command for certain things. I think this is actually a broader discussion, and I can bring it up at a refactoring meeting.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea in general. Some things are, especially like long-running tasks, are hard to do in HTTP requests.
Yeah.
But there's definitely a lot of Rados GW admin features that aren't exposed and could be.
Yeah. Since this meeting is more of going over the features and and not having too deep of a discussion about them individually, I'll bring this up at a RGW specific meeting sometime in the future.
Sounds good. And did you say that Rook is making heavy use of the Go Ceph library for admin apps?
Yes.
Yeah, that would make it a obvious candidate for test coverage in Tuthology. That would be great.
Yep.
All right, moving on to IAM accounts and groups. This is a feature that Abhishek had started work on years ago. And I picked it up for a while and made a little bit of progress, but there's still quite a bit to be done. Not sure how much this will be prioritized, but I'm still interested in making progress there. I think it could go a long way to kind of unifying Swift's tenant with the S3 view. But I mean, there's a lot of IAM policy integration that we're missing without support for accounts and groups as it is. Another one that I added was about object integrity checking and checksums other than MD5 and ETAG. This is something that Matt has put a lot of thought into. And I just linked to an outstanding PR and a link to Amazon's documentation about integrity features.
And there's also a PR that I added that introduced long-term checksums. I think that's I think that's more like the ETAG case. This is implementing this PR is implementing an Amazon API that exists. And I think it intersects with the work that you wanted to restart or finally get going on to accelerate crypto. Cryptographic checksums is the main thing that S3 does with it.
Yeah, that's another initiative that I think is interesting, is using AVX to reduce our CPU usage and speed up these calculations. We've discussed that recently in refactoring calls. Next section is about testing.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
take it away, Corey. Thanks.
Yeah, the theme here is really just improve testing in the face of errors and latencies, I guess. And like the S3 test repository already has a lot of coverage of, I guess, the happy path of testing there, and is quite good. But we found some gaps over time there, especially for the cases where there's concurrency issues, which are easier to produce with some latency, and just cases where errors are happening at lower levels and end up causing discrepancies or artifacts left behind. And so I think just some focus on different types of testing to catch those kinds of errors. We had discussed in some other RGW stand-ups the idea of using warp tooling and other means of testing like that to potentially do that. So I think that's the gist of it, is just kind of a focus on alternative testing methods to catch some of those things better.
Yeah, that would be great. There is some limited thrash testing, which is, I think, more about just daemons coming up and down. That could be a good way to expose some of this, but maybe a way to just introduce latencies could also work. In terms of kind of the issue of orphaned objects and index entries, you're writing some tooling to scan for those, and I think it would be great to just run that command and at the end of RGW tests and check that it doesn't return any results. So that could be a good way to validate that we're not missing anything, as long as we had some interesting workload that might produce some of that. There's also a lot of interest in performance testing. I agree. I think that's kind of hard to do in the Toothology environment, but I know that the Rados team has done a lot of work there, so maybe we could learn from them about what works and what doesn't. But I do think that we need some way to get reproducible results so that we can so that we have a way to compare before and after when we're doing performance work, and also to validate releases that we're not regressing in performance from the last one. That's something that Mark Nelson has been good about, just around releases, but building on that process would definitely help a lot. Any other thoughts on testing?
Well, this goes to the right place to ask, but do we have the right environmental support to do what we want there, or whatever? What is required in addition to script the drivers and things? What is required in the environment?
Sorry, Matt, It's hard to understand all of that. You're asking about the toothology environment and whether that's.
So you say, am I breaking up? Is that what's?
You are, yeah. I'm not
Maybe
sure what it is.
reconnect. I think. Well, I plugged my microphone after starting the session. I'm gonna change it. Oh, one second. Is that by any chance better?
Much better.
Yeah, that's an interaction between the web browser control of the speaker and the microphone. Anyway, never mind. But so I just want to ask if we have, if we have the environmental support we need to do performance, as you said, repeatable performance testing upstream, or conversely, what we need.
Well, I mean, Mark Kogan has done a lot of performance work just using machines in the lab, right? And I think he just, I assume that he just reserves some and has a consistent environment to do those tests on.
Yeah, okay. I mean, it's similar to what Mark in the past, or I continues to do. So okay, it's not automated testing, but that's something that we just do the same way regularly.
Right. Yeah, maybe we could have a meeting with him just to brainstorm about what parts of the process could be automated in a way that gives repeatable results. I think that the multi-site skill workload testing that we've been doing as part of the resharding project also falls under this, and I think it was that same hardware that Mark has been using. All right, let's move on. Production introspection tooling. Who would like to discuss this one?
This one was from us too. So yeah, one of the ideas, I guess, was the one that David put there in some detail, was just a tool that shows some real-time stats on clients and maybe at more granular levels, like the particular buckets, in terms of rates of throughput and number of objects over time that are being uploaded, to get a sense of which clients are maybe abusing the cluster or using it the most. Kind of goes in with the QoS stuff in some sense, just to understand the relative usage of the cluster among different clients and buckets. And then we had kind of discussed some other, like, smaller, nice to have improvements to other Rados gateway admin commands for ops, like little things like adding indication of whether buckets are versioned or object lock is enabled, stuff like that, that makes things easier when managing a cluster and dealing with those kinds of questions.
So this sounds like maybe it goes with the labeled perf counters.
Yeah, it sounds like those might be useful for a similar purpose. If you're, yeah, I can see where you're saying those go hand in hand.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm not sure if you can. Okay, you can't hear me good. Yeah, I'm not sure. Because from the label perf counters, and I guess we saw the entry for Prometheus. We just assumed that was something that you would scrape, but we already know that there's pretty significant cardinality issues that kind of lie going down that path if you're doing kind of collection of those at production scales. And so this is more to give the ability to either selectively or for short periods of time emit kind of real-time insight into what the cluster is currently doing. So an example use pattern would be what we see right now, where we might see our cluster doing, 70,000 read requests a second or something like that. And it bursts up to 90. And we're curious, well, what's going on? Is this a user or something? Well, we have centralized logging for all that RGW operations, and we most certainly could go do statistical analysis of that and try to break down the multi-operation calls and figure out, do we have a client or clients that are suddenly spiking a load, or someone that's being abusive in some shape or form. But instead of having the tooling kind of similar to the RBD related tooling, but with a more granular level of filtering, would be enormously helpful from an operational perspective. So it's not about necessarily collecting long-term statistics, although that would be useful. But there are relatively clear problems with that when you start talking about the Prometheus Ramir type or TSDV style infrastructure that's necessary to support that. So this would give you the ability in real time to say, like, okay, what's going on in this cluster, and perhaps I put some examples there. Top 10 most active in terms of IOPS buckets, or maybe you wanted to do throughput, or whatever the situation might be. And then you could use information derived from that to further filter, okay, let me go look at this bucket. What calls are being utilized most, and what rate are those calls being utilized? Is there a specific prefix involved, et cetera? Like, willing to enable that from an operational perspective would be enormously helpful in the kind of day-to-day care and feeding of these clusters.
Well, it seems
Yeah.
like that has a lot to do with label counters, or could have. And would you be able to use the dashboard as tooling to then help poke through and investigate things that are coming up as top tens and whatnot?
Yeah, well, certainly. I guess the problem is just scale, right? So, like, we have a pretty large deployment. I think we're at something like 6 million series that we're recording in our Mimir based TSDV system. That's without per bucket or per user labels that are associated with all these different operations. That would probably result in at least an order of magnitude, if not more, load. And this is already a pretty expensive operation. So when we start talking about production scale, when you're looking at 300, 400 plus petabytes of data and users, that becomes relatively untenable because of the potential performance impact it has for kind of utilization of this. And to be clear, we're not using the built-in dashboards. We use the Prometheus exporter functionality, and we scrape it ourselves because the built-in wouldn't scale.
Oh, yeah, no, I
So-
totally believe that. I guess if you look at I mean, if you look at what Casey and Ali and Casey really worked, or I should say, really worked on it. I mean, there's a kind of a scoreboard that has the label, that has some of that's designed to absorb a limited number, so it'll be ideal for like top 10 of label counters on different dimensions, and then they go out the exporter. So
Gotcha.
So I'm actually imagining feeding it back into the dashboard, not having it, not involving it in the hot path, but letting you view those time series.
Yeah, I understand. I mean,
like,
but
I was gonna say, I feel like the key thing that you and Corey are talking about is you don't want the ability to do this over a very long period of time. You just want to be able to go and inspect over some defined time length and be able to filter, not over all the buckets, but over just some subset of buckets, for example, or some smaller subset.
yeah, so like,
And
let me
be
give
able to do that like at will.
Exactly, because here's a not hypothetical but hypothetical situation. We have a customer that calls in and says, like, "Hey, I'm getting bad performance. What's going on?" Your immediate steps are like identify what bad performance means. Okay, they say that, like, "Hey, I'm trying to do these multi-object deletes, and I'm getting 1,000 object delete per minute or something." okay, well then we have to go identify what that problem is. Right now, that would be crawling through logs. That would be, going to each individual Ceph machine. Granted through, our own metrics dashboards and what have, but trying to like narrow down what's going on. Whereas if we could just be like, Rattle CW admin, top 10, IOPS users or something, we would much more rapidly identify an area to key in on. And to your point about the historical information, we already have that through the logging that's submitted with operations logs, but you have to be able to identify what to look at. Otherwise, it's needle in the haystack where you're just digging through, 50 billion log lines per second. You've got to figure out what specific thing is causing a problem. Whereas if you can just very rapidly identify, like, here's the command that gives me top 10, here's the command that shows me data around the bucket that I've identified as one of these, bad users or noisy neighbors, or whatever they might be. And then you can get a little more insight into what's going on. And it just helps you rapidly work through a very complex problem. But instead of a 30-minute lag time from customer has issue to you've identified where it is, it's like 2 minutes.
Oh no, totally. We've been having discussions about this too, and like the counter cache inside of RGW is designed to sort of help with that, but it needs some sort of tooling. I mean, RGW admin is okay, but we'd love it to be self-service or automated in the same way as self-service tooling.
No, that makes sense. And I think a lot of what the work you'd be doing to implement something like this could be potentially thrown into the health related portion of Ceph. So you could say, like, you could define values that you consider bad, or you could use some kind of, um, I guess, fine delineated set of counters where if you have something that's notably outside of kind of normal, whatever normal may be defined as, you emit some kind of alert that there's spurious activity. Like, those are the kinds of things that I think would absolutely be useful. But again, to your point, a lot of this would be implemented on the back end kind of the same way, and just how you choose to expose it is really the kind of the difference. And so, from our perspective, what we were suggesting was the ability to add this into the tooling to allow for rapid kind of administrative investigation.
No, yeah, I mean, I think we'd like. I mean, I think that's convergent. So, I mean, if you want, I mean, I don't know are you planning to help contribute? Because I think we'd love to. I think you could start, or we could collaborate around this stuff, and again, you have different ways of accessing this, the same ideas, and anyway, I mean, we don't. They're hitting and other ideas aren't there yet, but I can see that they'd be part of your workflows, and once we had them. It'd be fun to see them in a dashboard-like context, or but I think your guys' experience with Prometheus, what it can and can't shouldn't do, is also interesting. A lot of our RFE sort of use cases are push it all into Prometheus, and there might be ways to do that, but we haven't been able to cut the wheat from the chaff yet.
Yeah, and absolutely, we're happy to contribute both from the perspective of experience, as well as we'll do our best to help, on the code side as well, where it makes sense to. But I think just kind of at least an initial discussion of the hows, the whys, and maybe some historical context around number one real world use cases, as well as real world operations of these systems like Prometheus from Ramir, where the data eventually lands. We're more than happy to help with that.
Yeah, hearing a lot about that stuff would be great, actually.
Maybe we get
Very happy to help.
some sort of summit on that. We could bring some of our downstream engineers who work on Prometheus up to a common conversation about that. We've talked about ideas that would allow you to do what you're describing in terms of poke a group of RGWs and get them to pin certain counters or certain labels, etc., and build it into a workflow. That sounds like it's orthogonal and useful.
All right. I think this has been a great discussion. Look forward to some more. But this gets to the end of our deck. Is there anything else that people want to raise before we call it? All right. I think that just about does it then. I will make sure that this stuff gets into the Ceph backlog on Trello. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.